So today is day 4,612 that Boswell Book Company has been in business, and we're thrilled to welcome Gary Shteyngart. Gary, of course, born in Leningrad, raised in Queens, did an MFA from Hunter, and now teaches writing at Columbia. Author of these novels, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, Absurdistan, Super Sad True Love Story, and Lake Success, plus the memoir Little Failure. Winner of the Stephen Crane Award for First Fiction, the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction, the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize. And he's also perhaps America's most prolific book blurber, and has recently written for oodles of journals, magazines, all kinds of great things. He's here with his novel, Our Country Friends, which reviewers, me, have called, quote, his best novel by an upstate country mile. And I said I never wanted to read a 2020 pandemic novel. I was saying that for quite some time. I was saying it by, April of 2020. But I was completely wrong. Blown away by this novel, and I needed to read a pandemic novel. I needed to read this pandemic novel. So Gary, welcome. Thanks so much for taking the evening to sit down with us.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. I was just talking to you about how one of my first book tours ever took me to Milwaukee, and I absolutely had such a blast. I think it really was one of the first cities I went to read outside of Manhattan and Brooklyn, and it was just great. I've never, when you go on a book tour, there's like an expense account, which to a young writer is like, what? But I remember I'm a big fan of sausages, and Milwaukee seems to have quite a few sausages. And I remember just ordering, taking them home to my hotel room and just gorging. It was just this incredible, I guess, sausage fest. Sorry, yeah, something like that.
Perfect.
And I love that museum with the bird. You know what I mean? The Frank Gehry, or who designed it? Calatrava, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the art museum here. Yes.
Oh, great
Spectacular.
Anyway, so as much as I love seeing you and seeing all those nice people show up, next time hopefully I will come back to Milwaukee in person.
Hope so too.
Yeah.
We'll roll out the red carpet and lift the bird wings.
Oh my God, yes, more of that bird, more sausages, great. So yeah, Our Country Friends, I wrote this, started writing this in March of last year during the pandemic. And yeah, I was up here, so I'm in upstate New York, and I've spent most of my life in New York, the city, but I moved up here. I'm more here now than I am in the city about 11 or 12 years ago. So during the pandemic, I ended up here. And I began, everybody was making bread, but I don't know how to make bread. I just don't know how to make bread. So I decided to write this novel instead. Well, that rhymes. So I wrote it pretty quickly, about 6 months, which is very quick for me. I usually take a long time because there weren't a lot of, there wasn't a lot of drinking going on the way things usually do when I'm back in the city or up here during non-pandemic times. So but I was very lonely, and I wanted to write about friendship. So the novel, while set in the pandemic, I think what hopefully works about it, why people seem not to be disgusted by it, as you would expect they would be about a pandemic novel right about now, is that, it really does have friends in the title. So it's more about friendship than it is about, the pandemic is sort of a background, and at times it's a comic background, at times it's a tragic background, but it's always sort of at the forefront are these relationships between these friends who went to high school together. And they're all trying to escape the pandemic in this kind of, it reminds me, I was reading a lot of Boccaccio, the Decameron, and just the idea of hiding out in a country house while there's a plague going on really appealed to me. So there's 3 friends. The main guy is Sasha Senderovsky. He's sort of like my stand-in. He's this Russian-American writer. There's his wife, Masha, who is not a stand-in for my wife. Masha's a psychiatrist. I have a psychiatrist, but it's not my wife. That would be too much. And they have a daughter named Natasha. So Sasha, Masha, Natasha. It's how Russians roll. There's not too much variation there. So the friends that come up, one is a billionaire app designer named Karen Cho, a Korean-American woman. There's her distant cousin, Ed Kim, who is a kind of a scion of a very wealthy Korean family, sort of like a Samsung type family. There's Vinod Mehta, who is also their friend from high school, who is this very broke, he's an adjunct professor and a short order cook and all this other stuff. And then there's Dee Cameron, like the Cameron, get it? Oh God. Who is this very fiery Southern author. And she wrote a collection of essays, and she's of the left, but sometimes she flirts with the far right just to get more a rise out of people. And then finally, there's this guy named The Actor, and that's just what we call him. And he shows up, and he's one of the hottest actors ever. He's just dripping sexuality, and he manages to just have an affair with just about everyone. There's all these triangles, love triangles in a very Tolstoyan way. So love, sex, food, and more importantly, friendship are the themes, I would say, of this book. Oh, one last character, the groundhog named Steve, who actually lives about 2 meters away from me outside. He has a house. He's this groundhog. He keeps eating everyone's vegetables and Christmas trees. He's kind of a libertarian, if you will. I can see him reading Ayn Rand in his little hole. He just thinks the whole estate belongs to him and nobody else should get anything. So he's kind of the villain along with the actor of this book.
Absolutely. You've answered. This is wonderful. You've spun through my first 3 questions on my page here without me even. No, it's perfect. It's why. Are you kidding? More events should be like this. I can sit and smile. I was going to say, I love too the dramatis personae you have at the beginning. I love a novel with a good dramatis personae.
Yeah, it's dramatis personae, and it's also in 4 acts, like a play.
Yes.
And I don't think I'll be spoiling too much by saying that Uncle Vanya, which was a huge inspiration to this book, actually gets performed during the novel with the actor obviously directing. So
I love the theatrical aspect of the book. I really do, and I want to talk about that. I do have one question that you talked about, how the novel got written. I'm really curious, what was the moment? Because I know you've said you were working on another book and everything like that. And, when I got the galley of this and read it pre, as we booksellers like to do, I read it and I was just, I was stunned. I emailed the editor, your editor, and said, this is wonderful. How did he do this so quickly? And even
Shteyngart wrote a good book. What?
Even he said, the editor, he said to me, I don't know how he did it. He wrote literature in real time. And I'm really curious, like, what was the first moment when you were just like kind of looking around? I mean, obviously the backdrop of the world and everything that was going on informs the novel, but what was the first moment when you were looking around at kind of the shit show that was going on and said, I can tell a story with this?
Yeah, I think what happened, well, first of all, I was writing a novel, as you mentioned, and it was supposed to be this very kind of funny academic satire set in a future where NYU, New York University, which is a big presence down in Manhattan, takes over all of Manhattan, kind of builds a wall, has its own police force, NYU helicopters, I mean, the whole thing. And it was this, I teach at Columbia, as you mentioned, so I know how academia rolls. So, that was going to be my little academic satire. But then things really started getting bad. And I remember coming up here in March 7th because my kid's school was canceled. And I guess everybody's school in New York and probably in Milwaukee as well was starting to get canceled. So we moved up here. And I guess one of the starting points was that the New Yorker magazine asked a bunch of writers, me, Laurie Moore, Karen Russell, I think Karen Russell. There was a bunch of us they asked to write short essays about the pandemic. And that really concentrated my mind, and I began, interesting, I was talking to a reader who had read the book and he said, in your usual books, there's a lot of description of smells and vistas, but here there was a lot of sound, and I think it's because I started to really register the sound that was going on around me because I'm here, I'm in the quiet of the country and I began to hear things like the barred owl, that kept hooting, and the coyotes that were always laughing and fighting and all this other stuff. I began to notice very simple things about nature. There was this deer who lost her mom for some reason, and she came and began to live in our vegetable garden. So all of and of course, Steve, the groundhog, was up to his usual shenanigans. So I became very much nature oriented, even though I've been here all this time. Usually we have quite a social life here because so many writers have fled New York and are now fully living here. But here I was with nothing but sort of my wits about me, and I began to fall in love with this countryside in a way that I never had before. So I started taking these long 3-hour walks all over the place. And, there were a couple of other people, they felt like they were pilgrims on some ancient road, walking up and down, people waving to each other, standing on the opposite side of the road. But I started to think, wow, this is really, I am in a dystopia. I was trying to write a kind of dystopia, but now this really felt like it. And I began to imagine what it would be like to have a lot of my friends over at my house. And we always invite people up for the summer. We have kind of like a fresh air fund going. All these urban people show up and, play badminton and swim and grill meats and stuff, sausages. So
see the real grass.
I'm sorry?
See the real grass.
See the real grass. Yeah. Oh, but don't play on the real grass because there's all that Lyme disease going around these parts. So people are not advised to actually lie on the grass or walk in sandals on it. But yeah, otherwise, yeah. So I started to write this pretty quickly. Late March, early April, I began to write it. To put myself in a country mood, I reread all the Chekhov I could in Russian and then in English, just to get into the mood. So obviously all the plays, it's funny how all of his really good stuff takes place in the countryside. And he lived outside of Moscow for, I would say, a large part of his life, and also practiced medicine as he was a doctor outside. So he would see the quote unquote peasants, So yeah, he was right outside Moscow, and this is kind of how I felt being outside of New York. And I began to write, and it all just started coming together so quickly because I think I was so lonely. And these 8 characters who are in the book became my constant companions. Like I would just think, okay, what's Dee up to today? I'd wake up and I'd be like, all right, what's Ed gonna do? And because all these characters are flirting and rediscovering old relationships, there's just so much room to sort of maneuver and to think about just how people interact, because my first books, I think any immigrant novel, his or her first books are going to be about their parents in a big way, because that's the defining relationship of your life. And you're always sort of struggling against that, trying to define yourself away from just your parents. And this is my 5th novel, and I've also written a memoir. By this point, I feel like I no longer am thinking just in terms of, as an immigrant and about my parents, but now we've already internalized our parents, all of us immigrants. And now I could just write about these friendships across, Korean, Indian, Russian, and Southern. There's a woman from the South. I used to belong to this immigrant writers group, and we had 2 Indian Americans, 1 Austrian American, 1 Russian American, and 1 Texan. And the Texan was the, he was always like, you guys have something to write about. I have to write about Texas all the time. And he was always like, I'm the true immigrant here, So that's sort of how Dee feels. So all of that stuff kept going into the novel. And I realized just how much, when you're alone and just inside your own head all the time, there's so much pent up material, and it just kind of rushed out on the page. And I found myself writing at double the pace that I usually do.
Wow. That's, yeah, pretty amazing. Talking too about all that group, I think it's really interesting that you're talking about moving away from perhaps writing those defining immigrant stories and everything, but moving into, because I was reading, you just posted an article from Moment Magazine that ended with essentially saying, this is your novel announcing yourself as an American novelist. And I thought that was a really interesting comment.
This was Saul Bellow and Philip Roth's big beef. But they always said, why are we the Jewish novelists? We want to be American novelists, right? And Saul Bellow began his novelog March with the declaration, I am American, Chicago born, I think is the first line. And obviously I'm not, I was born abroad, but I teach a class on immigrant fiction in Columbia, and it's always interesting how some writers want to define themselves as having a hyphenated identity, and others are saying, screw that, in America, we're all hyphenated, except obviously Native Americans. So let's own that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see, speaking of that article, I saw the Roth and those references, but as I was reading the book too, I kept thinking of Updike and the trappings, the upper middle class East Coast trappings.
Yeah.
Put these characters in and everything, and seeing it in those kind of terms as well, I thought was really interesting. But to then have all of this cast of essentially, immigrant and children of immigrant characters in those trappings.
Yeah, I think Updike obviously was influenced by people like Chekhov, who in turn also influenced me. I mean, there's a certain kind of, The country and I guess suburbia also, they lend themselves to a certain kind of cadence that distinguishes itself from the urban novel. My mentor was Chang-Rae Lee, the Korean American novelist who taught at Hunter and got me my first publishing deal. And he was interesting because his novels were about Korean Americans to a large extent, but they were all set in the suburbs. And he grew up in Westchester, which is a famous suburb of New York. And that's sort of so he felt to me very like up the Korean American updike in some ways. So yeah, I definitely felt that was kind of strumming along in this book. But also, usually I'm quite a satirical novelist, but my satire usually focuses on the Soviet Union, where I came from, which has always been a kind of disaster, and is a disaster now in the guise of Russia. But now that sort of the blank hit the fan in America, during the pandemic and our never-ending political crises, I guess the satire sort of got squeezed out of me because, not only do I live here, but I have a son who's going to live here. He's 8 years old. So my feelings about that changed quite a bit. And I think that's maybe why this book is less satirical. Hopefully it's still very funny because, I gotta do funny. I don't like, somber stuff, but it's a little less satirical, I would say, than a novel like Absurdistan, which obviously says, hey, I'm a satire just off the cover.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I found myself laughing at plenty of points, and cringe laughing throughout this novel in the best of ways. And I want to talk about that, the satire and the shift, I don't think away from it, but a shift to a different tone of it in this novel. I'm always curious, and this is my one writery question, I guess, for the evening. But I'm always curious, like, where your satirical voice, when you first developed it, where did that come from? Where'd you first find that voice? And this is kind of going back, but.
Yeah, going back, but I think that's an easy answer. I mean, I think it's my parents, because growing up in the Soviet Union, they kept making jokes all the time, and they were always kind of whispered in the kitchen. And they began to tell me these jokes more after we left the Soviet Union because they didn't want their kid blabbing that they were making really anti-government jokes. And a lot of them were about Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, the general secretary of the Communist Party, and he was like a doddering idiot at this point. He was very, everything he said was just a joke, but there he was on television waving, and so they would make these jokes. And when I came to America, I didn't speak English, and I was put into this Jewish day school called Solomon Schechter, and it was really tough. Kids bullied me because I was wearing this giant Russian hat all the time and had a big fur coat and just looked basically like a moose in human form. There was a lot of fur going on. And so, and I didn't speak English well and didn't speak English well until I was about 14, but I wrote this take on the Torah called the Genora, and it was basically like making fun of all the rabbis who were always beating on us. And, the kids loved it. And that was my first satire. I remember like Exodus was Sexodus, all this, very raunchy, pubescent stuff. But it made me my first American friends. Yeah, it made my first American friends, and it was very cool. I was like, oh, writing is a good thing to do. So since then, I really wanted to be a writer. And then I went to college in the Midwest, Oberlin in Ohio, which had a really good writing program. And that's when I began writing my first book. Russian Debutante's Handbook was started senior year at Oberlin. So yeah, I was always, and that's very much a satire of both sort of, I don't even know what, sort of the upper echelons of a school like that, as well as the collapse of the Soviet bloc.
And just a side note, I went to Worcester, just down the road from Oberlin. So
down the road, yeah, that's right, Worcester.
So we would just go up to Oberlin to party for the drag ball. But
yes, we had a great drag ball. I remember.
Fantastic.
I remember barely walking away from that one day and just passing out on the road because it was a very exciting drag ball. Yeah.
I am curious though, and you touched on it a little bit with this novel, and I think lots of people have pointed out. I think the satire has gotten less pointed, or at least less pointed toward maybe your own characters. I think a lot of the satire in this book is most pointed when it's pointed at your kind of avatar for yourself, Cinderovsky. But that said, I don't know. I think a lot of your books have always had, what makes the satire so effective is there's a pretty deep well of empathy towards all your characters.
Yeah.
But what changed this time out?
Well, I mean, just going off what I was saying about, the way the country changed as well, and the way I'm obviously quite attached to this country, given, that I have a kid here now, and I can't just take off. I mean, I'm very much rooted here now. I think one thing that began to change is this idea, and some of the characters voice it, is, that we came from families that fled. My wife's Korean American. Her parents left after all the havoc that was wreaked first by colonialism from Japan, then the Civil War, and then the economic malaise that Korea experienced until very recently. My friends have left India after partition, and after their own economic malaise. You name it, all of these characters. And we left Russia after the Soviet Union, after Hitler and Stalin, after all the debacles that my ancestry has faced. So a lot of us, I think, left. Our parents took us here, but the idea was that this is the safe place, that everything's going to be okay, because once we got our green card and then our citizenship, it's all going to be great. And the events of the last couple of years have been so difficult in some ways that, the characters begin to ask themselves, well, here we are in this supposedly safe place, and, we can't even get rid of this pandemic with all of our wealth and know-how. We're in this political paralysis. And, people were saying to me, Gary, well, you shouldn't write this novel because by the time it's published, the pandemic will be over. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so, because that's not what I'm sensing. As somebody who comes from a superpower that collapsed, I kind of know, I get a sixth sense of when things are going wrong. So I think that's an important part of these characters' development, is the fact that their parents fled here, and now they need each other more than ever. Their parents have either passed or have moved to Florida, and they're no longer the big background of their lives, but what they need now is each other. And that, again, is where the friendship kind of, when I was pitching this novel to my editor the first time, I was like, it's like Chekhov meets the Big Chill, and it's funny because when I talk to younger people, like, what's the Big Chill? But it was this 1980s movie that made a huge impression on me, even though I didn't know English well. But it's about a group of old friends from the University of Michigan getting together after one of them commits suicide, and it's all about their friendship. So it was a huge influence, even though when I watched it the first time around, I was like, what is happening here?
I'm picturing you as Kevin Kline now.
Oh God, yes. I mean, thank you. Yes, I will take that. That is very nice.
I think too, the novel, you touched on this before, and it's less to say about it, but the staginess of the book, I love the way that not just the structure of it, but it's staged very much. It's a play in this house, and then we're taking a walk. But the narration too is at times is very conscious of telling the action and everything like that. I'm wondering how theatery in your head were you when you were writing it?
Yeah, this was definitely the theateriest thing I've ever done. And in part, so in the book, Sasha Sindarovsky has he's working on a TV adaptation of one of his books, and the actor is there to kind of thwart him because the actor is a real jerk and keeps getting in the way of him ever finishing this screenplay. But I've actually been writing a lot of screenplays, and I've been in a lot of TV rooms. So I worked a little bit on Succession, which is a great HBO show, as a consultant. So my mind was very much in TV land right before the pandemic hit. So I was thinking about that quite a bit. And 3-act plays, here it's a 4-act play, but all that kind of structure was really important to me. So I was thinking in those terms. A very good friend of mine who kind of formed a pod with me and my family is a dramaturg at an important theater in New York. So I was always sort of swinging by ideas about the actor with her. Can an actor, have you ever heard an actor do something this awful? And she'd be like, yeah. So that was an important part of it for me, was thinking in terms of theatrics, and obviously rereading Uncle Vanya. I was reading, oh God, what is the name of that book? But it's a method actor's book. It's not the Meisner technique, but there's I can't remember it offhand, but just reading about acting and actors. And I remember a long time ago, my wife got me acting lessons with Louise Lasser, who was a famous star in the 70s and 80s. I think Mary Hartman was a show. I think some older people may remember it. She was also Woody Allen's first wife, which is not good, but I love the acting world. So it was fun to kind of put this in terms of a play.
Absolutely. So getting really into the book, part of the plot hinges on the Karen, who's our tech gazillionaire of the book. Part of the plot hinges on the app called True Emotions that she's invented. Tell us what True Emotions does.
Sure. So True Emotions is this app that's in the book where two people take an iPhone photo. They're posing next to each other. They take a photo, and as they do so, they look into each other's eyes. And then the app, the algorithm, does this thing. It's like a love potion, and 50% of the people who take this photo or so fall in love with the person that's in the photo. So, it's sort of a plot device in a way of, think of like Puck and Midsummer's Night Dream, right? It's a way to get people to fall in love in this book. And this happens pretty early, so I don't think I'll be giving too much away. The actor falls in love with D, the Southern essayist, and other people fall in love with D, and other people fall in love with the actor. So you really do get a lot of these sort of love triangles happening. But yeah, and what I was thinking is the way these algorithms now control so much of our lives. If you're out there shopping on Amazon, you will be told what to buy, and if you're so much of our lives, if you're on Instagram, the computer will now find you a friend or possibly a mate or a lover or a future spouse. So this was sort of just a more sort of a high-handed way of getting that across. In my novel, Super Sad True Love Story, I've kind of already lampooned technology, but this is my attempt to do it in the year 2021. So that plays a role in the novel as well, a very destructive role, because also remember that social media played such a destructive role when COVID rolled out, all the misinformation and all the other stuff. So to me, using technology as a kind of to demonstrate all the damage that was happening to our country at that time felt like the right thing to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I loved it because it is so destructive, and yet at the same time, it's the idea of the app is so ridiculous and vain and insane. But I mean, so is the idea of most social media. I mean, it's ultimately ridiculous and vain. And to me, I'm wondering if that's where you were coming from with
Yeah,
it.
very much so. I mean, there's, I grew up in a bar basically on the Lower East Side where I would meet all of my friends and I would meet people I didn't know, and we would get into these hilarious conversations. And life, in the pandemic reinforced the social media order. I think, so many people, including relatives of mine, just completely went into these silos where a lot of what they were learning and hearing was just not true, but they began to believe it. And so, I sometimes go to a diner in my little village, and there are some people sitting at the bar who, are talking about not getting vaccinated. And then a friend of theirs will get up and he's an EMT or something like that, and he'll give arguments for it. And that contact makes people change their minds about things, in a way that social media does the opposite of, in a way that social media just reinforces whatever prejudices you show up with. So, it's been, the pandemic has been very painful in so many ways, not least, of course, all the people that have perished, but it's been even more painful in getting people off of social media and into real life. So in my book, the sort of one of the conceits is that to do anything, there's very little Wi-Fi in this house. So they all have to, there's only one room where you can get it, but the rest of the property, there is no Wi-Fi. So characters actually have to speak to each other, So that's the way I kind of hopped over the contemporary scenario where everyone's just on their phone all day long, by actually having them talk to one another all the time.
Yeah, it's a convenient tool, just nothing else as a writer as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of you coming of age too, the characters, almost all of them in the book, came of age in New York in the late 90s. And there's a pivotal scene, I won't give anything away, but a big scene in 2001, but that kind of era in New York. And a lot of the story hinges on them going back to and rehashing their memories of that time, which I love. And I'm hoping will you walk me through their New York City?
Yeah.
Like, what do they love about it? What do you love about it?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking, I think, earlier about the fact that I spend most of my time now upstate. And I think it's in part because New York has become one of the duller cities that I know. And it's hard to imagine ever saying this. I know, I still love it. But, there's, where I live on the block around me in New York, there's like 5 Walgreens and 3 Chase Banks. And, all of the flavor has gone out of the city, it feels like sometimes. And I know that there's places in Queens that are absolutely great now, places like Jackson Heights where, life is still interesting and people are interesting, but everyone around me seems to be almost the same kind of person up there, which is why living in the country is such a relief, because so many people have fled here even before the pandemic, but definitely during the pandemic. I remember going to the DMV in a nearby town up here, upstate, and a woman came out and said, I am not renewing licenses from Brooklyn. If you're from Brooklyn, go home, because there were so many people from Brooklyn hanging out there. But for me, that the 2001 that these characters remember, and here, I got to say one thing, that obviously, as a writer, I'm a born nostalgic person. I think it's hard to be a writer and not be nostalgic. So yes, perhaps I'm looking at it with rose-tinted glasses. But I do remember in New York where absolutely anything and everything could happen. It wasn't like you would go out and somebody would be like, I got an AT&T iPhone free if you subscribe now. It would be like some dude would come up, and this is a scene from Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City. It opens with him coming out of the subway, and this dude's like, I got a ferret. You want to buy a ferret? It's a great ferret, live ferret, And it was all like that. It was like a never ending stream of stories, hey, buy a ferret, buy a groundhog, sure, it was a little more dangerous, and that's not good, of course, but on the other hand, it feels like New York has become this just plastic place. But the 2001 that all of these characters remember, where all the important relationships of their lives were first forged, and where Sasha began his career as a writer, and Karen, who became this billionaire app person, began her career. All of that is very important to them. So the book is set very much in the present, but also because it's about friends, there's also a lot of looking back.
One looking back moment that I love is the needle drop in one of the early things where they start singing that Cameron song too. You smoke, yeah. I smoke.
You smoke, you drink. Yeah, yes. Yeah. There's a lot of the music of that era. And I would say also, the book, because I eat so much, the book is also about food in quite a big way. Food is a communal thing. So many of the scenes in this book are set around dinners. And when I have my friends come up from the city, sometimes everyone will cook their own dish, and there'll be like 7 courses served up here. And the book actually contains some pretty good recipes. And I thank a friend of mine in the back for this incredible vitello tonato that he makes with over sweet peas. Oh God, it's so good. Oh.
Yeah, the food in the book is incredible. On a different note, though, I want to talk. I want to talk some about the paranoia in the book, and that kind of sense that goes through it. Because everyone in the book, of course, all the characters they're very big, well-rounded, huge characters, and they all bring lots of fears, lots of desires to the book. But then on top of it, you have this layer that I think you caught extremely well in the book of everyone's got, to some degree, this fear about the virus, this fear about what's going on, and just the sense of how frantic making that extra layer constantly is. And I did think, as I'm reading, I'm like, this is another writer's dream, because it makes everyone act completely out of their minds and rash and shouting at the same thing. But I think there was a lot of truth in what you got, this kind of sense of shared anxiety in there. How did that kind of anxiety, that public fear, inform the book from outside or inside?
Yeah, there's a scene in the book where, and this was just basically me cribbing off what was happening. I went to our cute little gingerbread village near where we live, and for the first time I saw a grandfather and his granddaughter, and both of them were wearing masks. And the first time you see that happen, and especially when you see it as a family, and 2 very vulnerable people, right, with the grandfather too, it just struck me as, there was one of those Andromeda Strain moments where you're like, oh my God, this is really happening. It's not just, and so I wanted to take these moments and put them in the book. There's a scene early on where there's a character, Vinud, who's always been in love with Karen, who went to one of his high school friends. And he sees her, and she's washing dishes or making a meal next to somebody else, and they're both wearing masks. And he hasn't seen her in ages. And he sees her, and he's so in love with her still after all these years, and she's never reciprocated. But all he can see is the top part of her face, and he sort of just focuses on that, So even intimate things, even and a lot of, and interestingly enough, a lot of my friends in real life fell in love during COVID. People who had been single for quite a long time, and they fell in love. And the first time they met their future, beloveds was when they were both wearing masks. So the mask became a kind of symbol for me of still, love is so great that even though you see half of someone's face, you're still able to to act on it and still able to fantasize about it. So toward the end of the book, there's this couple that forms and they decide to have sex. And one of them says, I want you to wear your mask, you know, and by this point they've already shed their masks, but you know, it almost becomes like a part of how they interact at this point. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing too, speaking of that fear, and I think you also capture the private moments of that incredibly well. Throughout the book, you have Ed, sort of Scion. He's, you know, kind of the, to me at least, all the other characters look at him as this world traveling kind of slick dude, right?
Yeah.
But he's immediately going in to have a panic attack in his cottage. Like that's the first time we meet him. Or Vinod, whose name I think I butchered in my head the entire time, but he spends the book having nightmares of intubation, you know, and everything of this. And to me, it really drove home, I think, the fact that the novel too, a lot of the private fears, a lot of the public fears they have and everything, you did this wonderful job of taking all of these dramas, but then constantly keeping that underflow, like undercurrent subtext of everyone's just terrified of death all the time.
Sure. I mean, you know, whether it's a pandemic or not, we are all terrified of death a lot of the time. I mean, it's, you know, and I think what is interesting to me is that, yeah, this novel is set during the pandemic, but if we're going to think about novels going forward, first of all, this pandemic isn't going away anytime soon, I think, but also, you know, if you look, I was just in Portland, Oregon, and I was doing a reading, and people were talking about the 115-degree weather they had that summer, which is completely unusual for Portland, and all the elderly people who died. I was just in San Francisco, where, you know, the whole city was under siege by fires. One of my favorite cities in the world, Sydney, Australia, has been surrounded by bushfires for you know, almost every summer they have this happen. So I think that going forward, whether we write a thing about pandemics or any other aspect of living in the world in which we live in, unless we're writing historical fiction, we have to deal with people's anxieties about what's happening, you know, in the same way that if you wrote about, I don't know, World War II during 1939 to 1945, obviously, no matter if you were writing about a small village or whomever, you know, or a romance in a small town in America or in Russia or in anywhere, even in Germany, you know, obviously the Second World War was going to be a part of that. So I think we now live at a time where the events are going to get bigger and bigger. And our anxieties are going to get bigger and bigger. And I think it's going to be hard unless you're going to write historical fiction. And a lot of historical fiction that's coming out now is also kind of in one way or another dealing with the present moment. And dystopian fiction certainly deals with the present moment. So this is a big moment, you know. This pandemic was not just a blip. The pandemic tied together with our national political crisis, the events of January 6th, things like that. I mean, these are really big events for this country. This is not a joke.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on that note, the other thing there's a lot of in the book is sex and masturbation.
Are we going to lose some participants? I could just see that number dropping. Oh, look, we just lost one. Like, I knew it.
Ta-ta.
Thank you. Thanks.
They'll log back in, I promise.
Okay.
But no, I am curious. There's a lot of fun going on in the book too, and I think what is it about the global pandemic that makes a house full of worried people want to get it beyond just being together? Worried people want to get it on.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. I think there's a kind of need for sensual interaction. Whether, I mean, you know, I mentioned the food, but I think the sex almost falls into that category. You want to experience all you can because you're so siloed away. The people I know that were, you know, in Brooklyn and Queens, in Manhattan, and in other very urban environments, I mean, to them, for months on end, they could barely venture out. You know, they would do a run to the bodega and feel like they were exposing themselves. And that, I think, bred not just anxiety, but a desperate kind of loneliness and a desperate need to connect. And having all these characters in this hothouse environment made that very natural. As I was writing this book, I was also watching the same show that is watched by some of the characters in this book, this Japanese show called Terrace House, which is really adorable. It's set in Japan. And it's sort of like our version of, I don't know, Big Brother, one of those shows where all these young people are thrown into but it's actually a very nice show as opposed to, in America, there would be just, screaming at each other and people having sex all the time. Here, it was just people basically, cooking soba noodles together and exchanging pleasantries. And it really calmed me down. Obviously, it was set before the pandemic, but that was something that was very inspirational. Just the idea of watching almost in real time, it felt like, because the show stretched on for thousands of hours, watching that happen.
Absolutely. I mean, um, I think the book has a lot of very visceral experience in the book, and throughout. I mean, even the very opening, Senderovsky driving like a madman through town and everything, and that very real visceral experience. And I think,
I mean, I just learned how to drive like 7 years ago, so look out. I'm really, I just don't understand space very well. Luckily I have one of these new cars that always like, it beeps all the time if I'm out of my lane, and if I'm getting close to hitting someone or something, it'll just stop. And I'm like, thank you, technology, for saving all of these people and animals, because I'm always about to hit a groundhog, usually Steve, and the thing just breaks for me. So it's got a groundhog alert.
we'll see. And Steve's a libertarian, so he would say they shouldn't be, there shouldn't be all those laws about seatbelts and whatnot.
Yeah.
So Steve's not even looking out for himself.
Over, I deserved it. Yeah, that's Steve for you.
Oh, Steve. Well, I do want to say I've got a few questions in the Q&A here, and I think we're about that time. If anyone else wants to drop one in there. And while we do that, before we get to those, I'll ask my final question for everybody. What's the question I haven't asked? What's the question no one's asked you that you wish someone was asking about this book?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I've been asked so many great questions. I mean, this was asked by a magazine, but I just was sort of writing like what my schedule is, the writing schedule, and I talk about how, I do 2 hours of walking to get my mind in shape, or 2 hours of swimming. During the summer, we have a pool here. Then I do 2 hours of napping, just to sort of, for all those thoughts that are knocking around, they're going to settle down and be, maybe refracted in some kind of Freudian thing. And then I do 3 hours of writing, and no more than that, because after that it's diminishing returns. Things really get worse. So yeah, 7 hours of stuff altogether: napping, walking, writing. And as I think I've mentioned, less drinking during the pandemic, because there weren't a lot of people around, and that really helps. I don't know how Hemingway got anything done. I honestly have no idea. It is really hard to write and drink at the same time.
It explains why the stories were that short.
Yeah, and why my novels are so long.
Okay, I've got a few things here. Let's go first with our pal David Malman. Says, first off, amazing novel, probably the best I've read all year. His question is about the narrative voice. It's an omniscient narrator who shows us the interior thoughts of all the characters and sometimes even animals. Acknowledges at times that we're reading fiction, but what Dave found fascinating was that the narrator would speak in the first person plural, like, we will soon see. So who is this plural narrator? David wants to know.
Yeah. I mean, I think, thank you, David, for that comment. And yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's our country friends. It's not my country friends. I kind of want these characters to be out there for everyone. When you write a book, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, in a way that film or television, with both mediums I love, can't quite accomplish, you're attempting to allow kind of a Vulcan mind meld with these characters who are obviously filtered through the author. No technology can do that kind of leap into another person's consciousness. And in this book, unlike some of my other books where there's maybe one or two main characters, Super Sad True Love Story is a duet between these two lovers. Here there's 8 characters, ranging in age from 8 years old to people in their late 40s, and ranging from immigrants to the native born. And occasionally I actually go into an animal's point of view. There's this bird, this yellow bird that has a kind of cameo. So yeah, I really wanted to do a kind of omniscient narrator, which is a big thing among 19th century Russian literature, this idea that you really can float around in other literatures as well, but for some reason I'm thinking more of Russian literature. Chekhov obviously was very good at this. So that became a huge part of it for me, was going into people's minds. I figured, if I'm gonna have 8 characters, I can't just have a kind of, I can't have them flat. I can't have this like a television camera sort of panning between one and the other. I need to jump into their minds as much as I can. And I thought the best way to do it was to have not just an omniscient narrator, but a narrator that could also represent the reader. Obviously, since we're living in such an interactive age.
All right. Our next question is Gary from Anonymous Attendee. Hello, Anonymous Attendee. Gary, how do you relate to Vinod?
Yeah, Vinod is a character who has a lot of health problems. He had a lung removed because of cancer, or part of a lung removed because of cancer. And I guess, this is something I've recently experienced, some medical issues, and a lot of friends I know, mine are okay. I'm going to be okay. But a lot of my friends, especially as we hit our 50s, a lot of very close friends are experiencing health issues, and some of them are quite troubling. And, that's just something that the relationship between people who are finally entering the phase of their life where, before illness wasn't really a consideration, but how they care for one another, how they're scared, how, in close friendships. In a lot of these friendships between these immigrant groups like myself, we became each other's parents. Our parents were so, in a sense, unreliable. They were working all the time. Their advice was always sort of, the advice my parents gave me was so Soviet in a way. There's a character, Vinod, was based on a bunch of my friends who are of Indian heritage. And one of them, his father said, he was giving him romantic advice. And he said, son, no woman will ever love you because of your low muscle tone, which is why you have to get into a really good Ivy League college, and stuff like that obviously made us become more close as friends, because we were also, friends, but also siblings and also parents in a way to one another. And so that creates a kind of dynamic where when somebody gets sick, you feel it even more so than others. So Vinod was a big representative of that. And Vinod is also one of the characters who, he has some ambition as a young person, but he doesn't know how to act on it the way these other immigrant characters do. And that's a lot of my friends, from these immigrant milieus. They have parents who are very, you got to succeed at all costs, but they just can't do it, and so he became kind of a sympathetic character in that way to me.
I think he does bring a lot of that representation of just the strata of class too that you're playing with in the novel in a fascinating way.
Yeah, it's very hard to write a novel in 2020 and not have class be a part of that.
Yeah. So John Eklund asks, can you say something about the character Nat in the book? I usually groan at precocious, eccentric kids in novels, but you know what? I loved them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nat is kind of gender fluid in her identity at this point. Yeah, I've always hated precocious kids too. But I have a kid, and he goes to one of these schools in New York for math and science kids. So there's a lot of these kids who are very sweet, and like my kid, they're very smart, but they often talk in a very adult way, and they can't quite modulate their voices toward more childish, way of talking. And here, Nat is surrounded by 7 adults. And I remember that too. I had a lot of trouble making friends when I was a kid with my peers, but I was always butting into adult conversations, and I always felt like I had something to say. And I remember a lot of adults were very angry at me because, in Russian culture, like I guess here too, there's the kids' table, the kids are supposed to be there, and the adults are talking about big things here. And I remember when I was a kid, my parents had these very kind of pretentious intellectuals over. And in Russian, like in Spanish or French, there's a formal tense and an informal tense, like I guess usted, right, in Spanish, and in Russian it's вы, and that's the polite form, and then the informal one is ты. So adults would all call each other ты, but a child speaking to an adult should say вы. But I would never use that, and I was always being corrected for it, and I was like, screw you, I'm smart, I deserve to be informal with you like my parents, So Nat is born, I think, of both watching contemporary kids and also reminding myself of myself when I was a kid. So she is. I'm so thankful for that comment about that you didn't find her too precocious, because I really do hate. I mean, I love Salinger, of course, but yeah, there are times when I'm like, just make it a little, just cut back on that. A little goes a long way,
Indeed. Charisse says, not a question. I am just so thankful for your Gary Shteyngart.
Oh, thanks, Charisse.
Yeah. And then we've got just a couple more here. Dave has one more question. Obviously, there are a lot of references to Chekhov, but Dave feels you were also inspired by Shakespeare's comedies. Yeah,
Yeah,
no?
yeah. I mean, sure. I mean, that wasn't at the top of my list, but obviously any play and yeah, I was actually rereading some Shakespeare. I don't know about the comedies, but I was rereading some of his plays. Hamlet, I was rereading. I mean, yeah. You know what Shakespeare is so good at is the mechanics of plot, and I think for many writers, who was it Philip Roth who said plot is an embarrassment? Some writer said that, and I don't entirely agree with that, but it's yeah, if you're writing from a point of view of a lot of characters, and you're writing about emotions and feelings and stuff, sometimes plot does take a back seat. But yeah, Shakespeare does it so well, and it's so flawless. And yeah, I brought up Midsummer's Night Dream as an example of Puck and his Cupid, his role as Cupid. And here, obviously, I came up with this app and as well as all these characters who fall in love with one another in quick succession. So yeah, Shakespeare, hard to beat Shakespeare. I feel bad for playwrights because he's still really something.
Indeed. Indeed. In the chat, there's one more question, and I will go ahead and ask it because here for a bookstore event, I think it is the perfect finishing question. Gary, what are you reading?
What am I reading? Yeah. So I am teaching a course at Columbia next semester called "So You Want to Write Funny," which is all about humor in writing, because that's been one of the biggest sort of concerns for me, is how to write humorously, but at the same time write about tragedy. And all of my novels, I think, attempt to do that. Many of them deal with the tragedy of growing up a Soviet child, a post-Soviet child in a superpower that collapsed, and all that meant for our parents. Now this is the tragedy of our own political problems and the pandemic, which has taken so many people from us. But I always want to do it in a funny way, and that creates a lot of tension. And a lot of writers I love are trying to address that one way or another. They want to write serious books that are funny, and try not to make that, what do you call that? Oh God, sorry, I'm losing my English at this point. An oxymoron, there we go. Try not to make that an oxymoron, the serious, funny novel. But to me, yeah, that was very important. And when I look at today's literature that I love, I'm thinking of books like Fleischman's in Trouble. That was a big hit last year. So I'm going to probably teach that in terms of contemporary literature that's very funny, but also is very much about themes like, the role of women, the role of careers, the sort of examining second wave feminism from a different point of view. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in that book. Class, gender, all these relationships are being examined, but it's also hysterically funny on the page. Another book, one that deals more with race that I love, but is also hysterical, is Luster by Raven Leilani, right? That came out a couple of years ago, also was an incredible hit. Also just so moving by the time you get to the last page, but it's also such a joy to get to that last page because the preceding 250 pages are laugh out loud funny, and also, as you were saying, very cringeworthy, which is always my favorite kind of laughter. That's one thing I love about shows like Succession also, is that a lot of this laughter is like, oh God, I can't believe this character, I can't believe Roman just did that or said that. But you also laugh with them and at them, and all of that stuff is very important. So yeah, those are kind of the things that I'm reading now in preparation for this class.
Absolutely. Being a bookseller, I can't help but make a suggestion. But it's a novel that came out last year in April of 2020, of absolutely wonderful, and called The Knockout Queen by a California writer named Rufi Thorpe.
Yeah, I heard that.
I loved it. I think it's there's some haha funny. There's a lot of ooh, that's uncomfortable funny.
Yeah.
And it's such a voice novel. I was sold. On the first page, when the narrator essentially refers to the invasion of Iraq and going after the weapons of mass destruction, what a whoopsie.
See, that's what I like. I like a combination of ha-ha funny and, oh, I can't believe I'm laughing funny, the kind of Larry David kind of way. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's like I say, as a bookseller, I can't help but try and sell you a book.
Please, you did it. Sold.
Well, Gary, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much for spending the evening with me. I've really loved it, and I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. We would not have a bookstore without you, Gary. Thank you so much, and everyone, thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much, Chris. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.